Oh, Jenny, are you available?
And my side of the story is we had just gotten caller ID. It was like long before cell phones. And so I saw on the phone it said Michael Cunningham, and I thought, I didn't know him, but I knew who he was, and I thought, well, there's supposed to be a lot of people named Michael Cunningham. I said that to my boyfriend, and then I was like, so
Yes. So we've taught, not together in the same class, but we've taught in the same institution, and and now I teach writing to undergraduates at Yale. Jenny's teaching, you're teaching?
Yeah, I was undergrad too.
Yeah, at Vassar.
Yeah.
And how do we want to do this? Yes, absolutely to informality. Maybe we'll talk just a little bit about the whole question of teaching writing, and then I'd rather hear what you want to talk about rather than hold forth. I'm not that boss. But Jenny, a question that comes up often for me is, do you think writing can be taught? Which usually actually means, let's face it, writing can't be taught, and you are ripping off your students.
It's basically a hostile question.
Yeah, it's always a hostile.
It's not asked by people that believe it can be taught.
Hostile question, but a persistent one. How do you answer it?
Well, I feel like can you teach someone to write brilliantly when they start out not having an ear or not having read a lot? Because of course the first part of becoming a writer is being a real reader. So I don't think you can do such a steep trajectory, but I think it can go a long way when you get a talented student to sort of have. I mean, I remember my very first writing teacher. She would just write. It's sort of like your story. Like she would just sort of write. She would say things that she thought were good, but then she'd also just write in the margins, "Arg, ugh, no, stop, unbearable." And I mean, I think that there's a way in which I've always found that the best students I have are also the humblest, because they're actually their standards, they're comparing themselves to not their peers or not whoever is the flavor of the month writer, but they've read a lot into great writers. And so they're often very interested in taking criticism. And I can see sometimes just extraordinary changes. And so I do feel like, especially because I'm kind of the queen of like compression and distillation, which is why I love your Native Son. The Book of Disquiet was a book that I read long before I'd been here. But I think that teaching sometimes how to avoid excess and when to underplay something, I think can definitely be taught. So I feel like you can't take it from nowhere, but you can teach certain sensibilities about writing.
Yeah. I also feel like, under the aegis of teaching writing, I'm teaching reading.
Yeah, absolutely.
That most of, 12 students per semester, are all 12 of them going to be writers? No, most of them are not. Most people are not writers. Most people don't want to be writers.
Sorry, Michael. Do they go into the course thinking that they're all going to be writers?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
In the MFA programs, yes.
Yes.
Okay.
But one of the things that I think we both love about younger students, undergraduate students, is some of them want to be writers, but a lot of them don't. They're just curious about writing before they become doctors or lawyers or whatever. Which actually, to speak to the point, I think of it as a class really about reading. That if you know more about what goes into writing, how it's done, how it's crafted and worked over, and whatever it is the writer does, you're probably going to be a more perceptive and conscious reader. And that seems indisputably valuable to me as people go on to be doctors and lawyers. If I can in any way help them to be that much more conscious of what they're reading and what it took to produce it, great. So it's a reading class that says it's a writing class. And I told this morning, but when I was in a graduate program, I had a teacher who pulled me aside and said, when you finish a story or any piece of writing that you do, I want you to go through and give every line a grade of either A or B. The gorgeous ones get A's, and the perfectly serviceable ones get B's, and then I want you to go back and rewrite all the A sentences. Because those, Michael Cunningham, are the ones that are about you showing off. They're sentences that are about your ability to write that sentence with 3 similes and 4 parentheticals and a couple of semicolons, and they're not in service to the story. And you need to bring it down. And I'm not sure, maybe I would have figured that out eventually, but it was fantastic.
And I think
she was right.
you might get completely different advice if you were a different writer. I mean, if you're a good writing teacher, like in some ways I have students that I have to say, be stranger, be bolder, don't hammer the strangeness out of your sentences, don't feel like you have to keep making it always be something in the service of something else. Don't always make it efficient. But those are students that err on the side of too workmanlike. Right? So it's like for me, I feel like one of the interesting things about being a writing teacher is I really love it. I really love teaching writing because each person who comes to the class usually comes with sort of preserving what is most interesting and strange about how they write, I think is part of your job as a teacher, and then understanding the excesses, whichever direction they go in, is the other part. And not trying to make them write like you. There's a lot of writers that try to make their students write the way they do.
Yeah.
But, I hope I don't do that. I don't know.
No, you're right. It's not one size fits all. It's about looking at what each student does. As you say, Hilma was right to say that to me because my sentences she was just right. Everything she said was true. But one of the big surprises for me when I started teaching writing was I had expected to have to go in and sort of talk my students down out of their Baroque clouds, that I was going to be seeing these crazy stories about I don't know what all, extraterrestrial kidnappings and for the most part it's exactly the opposite.
Yeah, you're trying to make them do.
Young writers tend to be conservative.
I think it's because America is like conservative about fiction.
Yeah,
I mean, it's sort of like, the last novel I wrote, Department of Speculation, I think of it in my own mind as kind of like a walking around novel or a philosophical novel, an extremely common kind of novel in Europe, but it was sort of a little bit of an odd idea in America to do that, because it's sort of like if realism still really holds a high place on the mantle. So it's a little bit like if you were a painter and anytime you painted something that wasn't a still life, people were like, that doesn't look anything like this bowl of fruit. I don't know what we're going to do with it. So sometimes there can be this conservative quality, and I think there's not, it always makes my heart like pitter patter a little to go to some country where there's like statues of writers all around. Really? Because that's, in America you're often asked like, well, how are you going to monetize it, or what? There can be that kind of element. So sometimes I think that depending where the students are coming from, sometimes they come in and they're already thinking a little worried about the marketplace, especially in MFA. And I always say, there's the temple and there's the marketplace. You're not allowed to go into the marketplace till you finish your time in the temple, and that means your whole book's done. They don't listen to me, but I give it a shot.
It's true. More often than not, what I find myself saying to the students is, how can we work together to make this something only you could have written?
Right, only you could have written.
Yeah. To make it unmistakably in your. First, we have to figure out what your voice is.
Right.
And then how to speak on paper in that voice. So we've already got all the stories we've got.
Right.
No one needs you to write another version of what we've already got. We need you to write something no one's ever seen before.
But sometimes the students are very concerned, and I feel like I was very much this person. But how to be original, and how can I find, and to me, the originality is completely in the telling. You know, it's basically like a stranger comes to town or you leave home. Like, you know, I mean, there's more stories than that.
Yeah.
But like, you do some variation of that. And often, when you were saying earlier that part of it is about reading, whenever I teach, no matter what story they give me, I always give them a suggested reading list. So with every time that I give my stories back, there'll be 3 or 4 short stories that I either want them to see someone treating the same subject differently, or sometimes it's because there's a little whiff of like interesting style and I want them to see an example of like what would happen if they really pushed that. And sometimes that can be great. I mean, sometimes you can find the writers you really love your whole life that way. If someone recommends one.
Yeah. So my students tend to be worried about imitating the writers they love, and what I always say to them is, oh, darling, if you're worried about turning into William Faulkner or don't worry, you'll be fine. And I would say go ahead and write fake Faulkner or fake Garcia Marquez for a few weeks. You will not turn into that person, but you might end up with a little Garcia Marquez chip in your brain, and you will write as yourself, but with just that little bit of Faulkner and Garcia Marquez in your head. So I say, go ahead, imitate. Go ahead. Don't worry.
Famously, like Joan Didion sat at her typewriter and retyped all of Hemingway's short stories because she wanted to understand how the sentences worked.
Yeah.
So sometimes as an assignment, what I do when I have undergraduates is I give them a passage. It's usually when we're reading Lolita. I give them it's really elaborate syntax and it's complicated. And I say, okay, I want you to write this. I want you to exactly follow the syntax, but I want you to, it has to have your own emotional content. Like, and they're like, no. But it's really interesting because they, even if they hate the assignment or it doesn't work for them in terms of writing, they come away saying, I never noticed like that's what was happening with that. There's something about manually typing someone's sentences in that, I don't know.
You just understand the craft.
You understand sort of like all the nuances, which actually, if they're a good writer, are going to pass you right. I mean, because you're going to be sort of, you might not be noticing them until you go back for the second look. Yeah.
No, I used to do that when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I'm sure we could go on.
Yeah.
Go on.
There are things people want to
We're enjoying ourselves.
Okay, let's go on then.
I'll tell the best piece of advice I ever got from someone that was like not a writer, but it turned out to be the writing advice that I think I use the most. Like Michael's here right now at this amazing residency, and even though I'm grumbling about how in America they don't have enough statues of writers, we do have lovely residencies there too. So I was at one of these, and I remember whenever you're there, all the writers are really jealous of the painters because the painters seem to be having so much more fun. Like the painters, all the painters are sleeping with each other, and all the painters have like music playing, and then they're just making these big things, and they don't, and you just feel sort of like, that's the life. And meanwhile you're like,
attic. I know.
I was joking with someone the other day that I basically like I'm teaching a workshop here with the disquiet, and it's called like how to pay attention, and I'm often talking about like how to be awake in the world, and I'm like, so what I do is I lock myself in a room away from everyone who loves me and from the like beautiful world that I'm writing about, and then I write about how to pay attention and be awake. That's like basically the basic paradox of life.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I was off doing that and envying this super cool painter that lived downstairs, and one day she said to me, I don't know what you writers do when you don't when like, what do you do on a day when the writing isn't coming or it's bad? And I was like, well, I just stay there and I pound. I pull my hair out, or like John Cheever used to tie himself into his chair with his bathrobes. But I just stay, I just stick it out, and then I'm miserable. And she goes, oh. And I said, why? What do you do? And she goes, oh, I stretch canvases. And I was like, oh my God.
And so
I kept thinking to myself, and to me this was actually the key for me of like kind of a new writing style. I've always liked to bring in things from other disciplines into my writing. So I like to bring in, it might be like facts about space, or it might be like natural science, whatever. And I like to sort of work interdisciplinary things in. So what I did was I started getting nonfiction books, and on days when the writing wasn't going well, I would type verbatim interesting facts and things from there. I would that was my stretching canvas, because I would still feel like I was working, and it would often allow the sort of writing part of my brain to start doing something. I only typed things that gave me a little bit of a, like, we all understand that there's chemistry in the romantic world, like that you might walk into a room and feel like but I actually feel that sometimes with just like objects or little facts or whatever. I feel a little ping. I feel that sort of, so I would only do it with something that gave me that sort of interested feeling, but I wasn't sure why, and I wasn't sure how to use it. And now I do that. My only problem is I'm really disorganized, so I can never find what I'll just be like, oh, where was that thing about the Arctic explorer? Somewhere. It was a bear. Like, I can never remember where it is. But I think typing it like that actually made it stay in my brain more, and maybe it was stretching canvases. So stretch canvases when you're stuck. Or become a painter. It's better.
Better. I wonder, when did you start?
Well, when I was in high school, I was like in drama. That's what I like to do. And so I was in plays, and I went off to college thinking that's what I would do. And then I took a playwriting class with a very terrible playwright, actually, who insisted only that we read his own plays. And I thought, such a drag.
That's so good.
And I just was like, I don't like doing this. And I just sort of took another class on a lark, which was a different writing class, poetry class. And I lucked into this sort of amazing teacher. It was in the South, and he had a really southern accent. His name Jim C., and he was super tall, handsome man with an eye patch. So, every once in a while he writes me, like, I get like an email, and I'm just like, easy. Like, I either hate you or love you on any given day, because you put me down this path. But he went in the very first day of class, and he wrote on the, like, chalkboard, it was like, no falling leaves, no one tear down your face. He wrote like a list of no looking in the mirror to describe yourself. He just made a list of things that he didn't want you to see in your poetry.
No.
Yeah. And
I hope somebody wrote a poem with
course.
only those things in
Of
it.
course. Yes. And he said every single semester, that's one of the ways he would know who the hardcore writer was, because they would immediately set out to do that. But sort of like shyly.
I was looking in the mirror, so the falling leaves are behind me, the red coat, the tears are fall from my eyes. Yeah.
But it's funny, because now that I teach, I'm like, oh, with the left eye tear. Yeah, I know why he was that way after so many years. But that's sort of been the thing since I was about 18 or 19. That's the part that students don't really like, the part where I take like 10 years to write a book. They're always really, they find that part of the story really uninspiring. They're like, oh, but what did you do all that time? And I'm like, oh, I waitressed, and I lived really I didn't have very much money, and my best friend's a poet, and we had $100. And we would trade it back and forth when someone's lights were going to be cut off, and they're always like. So I think the friends in low places that do something similar, but it's just what I wanted to do. I was always a big reader, and then for me it was poetry first. But I actually sort of revered poetry so much that I didn't feel like I could write poetry. So I started writing prose, and but I kept reading poetry, so they sort of crossed a little bit in my work.
I can't write poetry.
Yeah.
I tried, and I love poetry. But
yeah, we're like weird. A lot of fiction writers don't read poetry, at least in the States. Like if you say it, they're sort of like, no. I know, but we're both of that school.
It became apparent that what I need to do is sort of throw B-level sentences at the sort of brick of narrative.
Yeah.
And I revere poets above probably all other people, but that ability to sort of spin the words into themselves, I don't
Yeah.
have.
Yeah.
I don't have. Without the story, nothing happens. So there you go.
Yeah, me too.
And I teach a literature class and a writing workshop. And the traditional form for a writing workshop is people submit a story and you talk about it, and then a month later they submit another story and you talk about that. And I thought, I think we're going to just write one story all semester long, and you're going to put it through 3 drafts. And
I'm gonna copy this idea.
if
Good idea.
it's really it's working out great. It's only been a few years, but I say to the students, write okay, number one, the good news is your first submission can be a total mess. It's almost better if it is. Don't think you have to turn in something polished, something, whatever you do, and then because you're gonna be continuing to work on it, and I don't need you to feel tethered to a story that you wrote dislike, but you have to keep the root of it. You can't. I don't want you to just dig it up and start all over again. And well, just last semester, I had a young woman in my class who was from American, born from East. Her family was East Indian. And she'd never taken a writing class before. Her parents wouldn't allow her. So her first writing class, and their first draft was already really interesting. It was about this sort of growing phenomenon in her imaginary world in which women are giving birth to babies, and when the baby is born, they look at it and say, "That's not my baby," and they're right. It's not a DNA match. And she had, it was fantastic. And she had she was working on some, like, where's the baby's really coming from? And I said, let's keep working with this. Something's here, something's missing here. I don't know what exactly, but it's a great idea, but it doesn't have enough life yet. And I couldn't tell her what to do. I wouldn't have told her what to do if I could have, but in the course of the next 2 drafts, she figured it out like this. One of the very first instances of a woman giving birth to a baby that truly is not, she's carried it, it's not hers, no one, and we never figure out where the babies are coming from. But the nurse is an East Indian woman who's very traditional, who can't accept her daughter's lesbianism. And I thought, wow. And it turned into a great story.
Yeah.
That was grounded. There was the one was a sort of perfect analogy for the other. And I was just so proud of her.
Yeah, it's like she had to find the emotional. Sometimes I'll ask a student, like, okay, what are you most drawn to in this story? Why do you, not like why are you writing it, like what thematically, but like what's the part that if you had to like take out, you'd be like, that's not my story anymore.
Yeah.
Because I feel like you've got to figure out, I don't feel like you have to write autobiographically at all, and I often think that people assume things are completely autobiographical, which are actually, we were talking about this today, emotionally autobiographical, meaning that you've had to have felt the feeling, but maybe not in that situation, which is, a sort of old acting technique, right? If you're going to be on stage crying about the fact that you've lost your daughter, you might reference another grief that you've had. But yeah, I think somehow zooming in on what it is. But she doesn't know. And I always say sometimes to my students too, sometimes will be attached to the original idea of a story, and I'll be like, I understand that's what you were gonna write, but you actually wrote something a lot better. It's a lot more interesting than that idea you have. So what if you did that? And it's sort of hard to let go of it, but I think your writing brain can be a lot smarter than your analytical brain in terms of fiction.
Yeah. No, and I think it's often
She was our
Good
student.
sign.
I keep looking at Reese's book.
Oh, I know.
We both had her as a-
former
yeah,
student.
see?
Look what happens. Study with us and you get yeah. We taught her everything she knows.
Yeah.
Jenny.
She couldn't have been there, yeah, we basically.
Yeah, no, she couldn't read.
She couldn't even read.
Yeah, we have.
She was already brilliant.
Yeah. Oh, what was I going to say?
Sorry, got distracted by the.
No, I'm not. I'm very happy to be distracted by Reese. We're so proud of her. Oh yeah, I think it's a good sign when a story, and I bet this is true for poetry too. In the writing of it, it defeats the little idea that took you into it.
I like that,
And
the little
becomes
idea.
something else. Yeah. That you. This is going to be a story of the whatever. The terrible cost of a remote father and overprotective mother, and then that gets you into it.
Right.
And ideally, it goes someplace that you didn't expect it to go. Flannery O'Connor once said, "Well, how can there be surprises for the reader if they haven't been any for the writer?"
I know, I think that's a great one, yeah.
Yeah, there's this great W.S. Merwin line about poetry, but I think it's the interesting thing about the prose too. Where Merwin said, "Write the poem. Write the best poem you possibly can. When you get to the last line, understand that that's the first line of the poem you're actually meant to write."
See, I write so slowly that this kind of advice just, I'm like depression era, like I want to save every piece of string, you know, I'm like, when you said, you know, a lot of these days I've only written 2 or 3 pages, I was thinking 2 or 3 pages, oh my God, like that's amazing.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah,
But,
we all write our own.
I like the one, there's a novelist quote about that when you're writing a novel, it's like driving down a dark road and you can only see as far ahead as the headlights show you. And that's how I feel when I write. Some people write differently and they make big charts and they figure things out ahead of time, and that's if that's how it works for you, then I think it's great. Probably you feel more calm. Is that my phone doing something?
I don't
Or-
think so.
No, okay. But yeah.
One more thing, and then maybe we'll have a couple
Yeah.
questions, then we'll have a drink, right? I find that the most frequent problem I hear about from students is I'm not good with plot. Well, funny, the word plot is already kind of an ugly word, and I feel like they will say something like, I can't seem to make a story happen, and I do the thing with my glasses, it makes me feel more professorial, and say, I think what you're probably telling me is you have trouble with fully developed characters, because one, or ideally more, fully realized characters will automatically produce a story. You don't have to impose a story on them, they'll make the story. So we do this exercise whereby 12 students just write a character. You need a lot of blackboards for this, 3 or 4. We sort of produce girls. We're having a
Hi.
conference, you know. You just kind of shout it out. Starting with the most basic age, race, gender, given that there's many genders, occupation, if any, closest emotional attachment, if any, where does this person live, how much does this person make, if anything, what would this person wear on a Saturday night, and we go on, and it gets more and more detailed. And then we get to what I consider to be the questions too seldom asked about a character. What does this person want more than anything in the world? Because desire drives narrative. It's really hard to do something with somebody who doesn't want anything. Madame Bovary really just wanted to go to parties. But she wanted it with such ardency. And Flaubert followed her so deeply into her shallow and trivial desires that he made a great figure of literature out of her. We've talked about this. So what do they want? They may not know it, but you should know. What do they want? What are they afraid of? And what is it they most don't want us to know about them? And then we will take a character, somebody who's come up, this person has a child, this person is in a relationship with somebody older or younger or whatever, and we do the same with that character. And we then we just look at the two characters and we start pulling things out. And it never fails. It never, ever fails. The story always happens. The last time we did it last semester, we came up with a woman who was a mother, and her secret was she didn't really want. She realized she didn't really want to be a mother, but she had to be. What are you going to do? You have to have kids.
That's a big secret.
Yeah. And so we kind of worked and okay, what's happening? What's the scenario? And one of the students raised her hand and said, "They're shopping for a gift for the person who doesn't want to commit to her because he doesn't want children. They're shopping for a gift for him. One of the children wanders off and she doesn't look for her right away." And that's the end of the story. Right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
And right there, you created all this.
There you go, out of nothing. Yeah, 20 minutes where we didn't have anything at all. And
Wow, that's great.
writing is easy.
I also am, like with my first novel, there was a section, I wrote the beginning and then in the middle, I just wrote in capital letters, something very interesting happens here. I left that way for like 4 years or something. But I was
It took you
like
4
as
years to fill the gap.
placeholder.
Yeah.
Because I think of, when I think of plot as plot, and I think people are different. Some people really love plot, but I don't. I'm more of a character, language, voice. That's what draws me in. So whenever the plot side, I'm sort of not that fun to like watch movies with, or because I can always sort of feel like I see the plot turn, or like sometimes when they make a really big deal, it's supposedly like just a casual habit that somebody has, and I'm like, oh, they're gonna bring that back around with the so like I think it could be partly like a occupational hazard that you get worried about plots, but to me I think of it instead as and it's like your wanting idea. A story has to have emotional momentum. Momentum is not exactly the same as plot, but it's similar to it. And then I also say if you're going to take something away that humans really like, like we really like plot. That's why things that, and that's why oral storytelling, would cut off at these moments, and that's why we go see these movies. I was like, you have to give something else. So it's like if you think of a composer who decides that they're not going to give you a beautiful melody because they're like an avant-garde composer. But humans like melody. They like really beautiful like melody. So, but can you do something really interesting there instead with one of the other aspects of music? So I feel like a little bit that way. Like I do sometimes just to give my students permission because they're like so told that they have to write a plot in the other workshops. I'm like, go ahead, write your plotless stories here. I won't. I don't mind, but I'll tell you where there's no momentum, and I'll tell you where there's no emotion, and we're gonna work on those, and because I know secretly it will create a plot, just like.
We try to identify the point in a story we're talking about, a student story, where we start to lose our attention, and why did that happen?
Yeah.
And what can you do about it? If it happens at all. But yeah, I always remind them, no one wants to read your stories. No one does. There's already too many stories.
Yeah.
Nobody is looking around and going, I hope there's a story here somewhere. And what you're saying when you write anything, a poem, a short story, a novel, is stop what you're doing and read this.
Yeah.
don't have lunch, don't have sex, don't go to your French lesson, read this instead. And you better give that person something worth having, whatever that is.
And I feel like you're also trying to teach them to have authority, because basically that's one of the only things you have as a writer. Like whatever course that you decide, okay, I am going to go this way. If you are constantly, like for me, it's very noticeable how often people will write. It's almost a cliche, but, or just as I've said before, I'm like, no. Like if you know that it's a cliche, if you know you've said it before, you're admitting that you know you're losing your audience, that you're not pushing something as hard there. And yeah, so I feel like the more metaphysical role I feel too, like as a teacher, is just that I feel like you've got to learn to tolerate uncertainty, because writing is it's an incredibly precarious profession. And once, Philip Roth, one of the most famous American writers ever, came to my workshop. In general, he was kind of a jerk, but he did say one thing that I remember forever, because it was so funny, because he'd written at this point 16 books or something. He said, well, it's odd with writing, because there's not that many professions that you might do for so many years and not feel a sense of mastery about. He said, try to imagine a surgeon who's been doing surgery for 20 years, and then they go into this operating room, and there's a new patient, and they're like, wait, is it the arm or the leg? Is this the scalpel? And they're going, and they're sort of like so what's so strange when you do a new project, I think if you're trying to write the very best you're capable of, you kind of have to throw out the ideas and tricks and things you figured out in the last book. So you come to it, and to me there is something sort of mystical about it, because like that uncertainty it's like once I tried to take, I took a series of classes, and like one was more like yoga things, and then one was like zazen sitting, and everybody loved the yoga class and everybody hated the zazen, which is just like, it's Buddhist meditation where you just sit there, and it makes people really feel terrified because they're alone in their head. And I was like, this is just like writing. Like I was like, oh, I'm good at this one. Like I'm terrible at all this other stuff, but like this one's just like every day. So there's a funny little like crossover to me in that uncertainty thing.
It's part of the deal. You will always feel a little bit incompetent in the face of what you're trying to do, and the minute you start to feel like you're really good at what you do, you're halfway to being a hack.
Yeah.
So there you have it.
Although you have those days, you have like you were talking about, like the swings from like, oh my God, I didn't realize I actually am quite brilliant, to like the self-loathing of how, and then oh, it's really quite amazing. Oh, that's a lot of the back and forth kind of thing. I think it's characteristic of writers. The one other piece of advice I got from a painter, which I thought was really interesting, it was in a little online group, and we were talking about our students and how often there's this phenomena where you have incredibly great students, but they don't go on to, and sometimes it's because that sensitivity that makes them such a good student, writer or painter, they're also, you're just fragile mentally, as we all are. But he said that one of the things he'd noticed is that he said, the ones who quit were the ones awaiting instructions. And he was just basically like, the instructions are never going to come. Like at a certain point, you just have to decide that you yourself are going to figure out how to do this, because you leave your school and you leave the teachers behind with all their ideas and their exercises, and then there's still that day where you're like, oh wait, no one is looking for my story, no one is waiting for it, like you said.
Marilyn Monroe once said, I wasn't the prettiest, I wasn't the most talented, I just wanted it more than anybody else. Marilyn Monroe, was she never wrong?
I relate to that quote. Like,
a question or two, and then let's go have a drink. Anybody? Anything else you want to talk about?
Just about plots.
Yes.
When you start a book, do you know how it's going to end?
No, I do not know how it's going to end.
Right.
I have an idea. I'm not just shooting blindly. I have some idea about where it's headed, but only only a vague idea, and I'm always sure that it's not going to get there. It's going to go someplace else.
So do you pick your characters first? And then-
Yes. I start with characters. It's
Now, where do you get the idea for the character? Is that walking around the street or?
you know, it depends. The Hours was really about my love for Virginia. That sort of came ready-made. Oh God, okay. How to tell this in a. I had a friend over who brought with him a woman who had stage 4 liver and colon cancer, and she was I never met her before, but she was a remarkable person, and we stayed up most of the night talking, and she talked very bravely about dying, and she's like 33, and she was a heroin addict, and she said, honey, at this point, why wouldn't I? And as the night went on, I sort of came into the living room. I'd been with my other friend Billy, and Tracy was just, it had started to snow. And Tracy was standing at the window, my apartment, wrapped in a blanket. And I just came up to her. We'd only known each other for a few hours at that point. I just put my arm around her and she put her head here. And I thought, the only stories I know about a drug like heroin are cautionary and blaming. Don't do that, you're bad and wrong, which is often the case, but I thought, I want to tell the story of this woman. You know? And it's not about being her as a heroin addict, but it's not about that. So like that, you know, you never know. Yeah, and that's where a book came out of that, out of a lovely dying woman on heroin looking out at the snow falling.
But, for example, if your plot, when the plot is getting richer, and when you're realizing where the plot is going, and do you feel the need to sometimes to change something in the character? Who would you compromise first, the character or the plot?
Oh yeah, wow,
That's a good question.
That's a really good question.
We will now make up an answer.
Probably there's no formula for that, of course.
No, I think.
Nicely done. I would compromise the plot because I would feel like, yeah.
You prefer the characters.
You don't like well, but I would assume that I had misunderstood what the plot was, if that makes sense.
I was gonna say yeah.
I wouldn't think that it would be that I hadn't seen something about it, because I feel like I would know the character. Like I might not know everything that's going to happen in my novel as I'm writing it, but like you say, I have a feeling for it, and I sometimes actually write something and I realize, oh, that's actually the end, and I move it and I put it at the end, and so I know that I'm like when I had that book, what I was telling you about, I knew I had the ending for quite some time. So maybe if I understand that, oh, so that thing couldn't happen then, if that would, I would think that I just hadn't quite understood the character enough.
I think I agree. I think there's two. First question is, are we hitting a ball in the story because I'm forcing the character to do or act in some way that they wouldn't, or are we hitting that wall because I don't understand? I don't really have the character yet. And you have to, you know what I mean? It's one or the other, but one or the other. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like those things often reveal themselves ultimately. Like when you hit, I mean, there's sort of a truism I find about like writing in different points of view. That like basically whichever point of view you pick, so you pick first person, or you pick third person, or you pick omniscient, and you think to yourself for about a third of the story or the book, like, wow, that's awesome. I'm really glad I picked that point of view. It's really working incredibly well. And then invariably, you hit a scene that you really need to have in there that would only feel like it would work if you had done it the other way. And so I feel like, and that point to me is like the plot question. It's like, do you go back and then change everything? Sometimes, maybe. Sometimes that's what you're doing. But often you're like, I have to think my way around this because I was being too rigid, or the way I think of it is schematic. I thought I knew it, but there's more mystery to it that's opening up.
Do you ever get the feeling that after you finish the book that there are other books that are not written in that story, for example?
Oh God, we were just talking about this. Yes, yeah. Whoever said no book is ever finished, only abandoned was, you know, right on there. I was saying my new book is due in. I really do need a drink. 2 weeks, and I was explaining to Michael that I have to give up the ideal book, the brilliant book, the perfect book that I've been working on for 6 years, and let it be an actual book. But my image of it is I was saying to him, I feel like I'm in a rowboat and I've been putting things in it to be ready for everything and every single important thought, and now I'm almost close to shore and it's sinking and I'm throwing things over the side, I'm throwing things over the side, I'm throwing them over the side, and I'm just hoping that I'm going to end up with like a few good shiny things that I need on land, you know. So yeah, there's a lot of stories still to be told, and I think sometimes people go back. Like I actually just bracketed something and I said, oh, I think that goes in the next book. And you can't really finish a book unless you feel like, I mean, that's sort of to me the mark of like people that really are writers. Like the idea that they would finish a book and then maybe not write it immediately, but you have to immediately think you're going to start picking up ideas and have the antenna up, or it would be too depressing.
Well, one of the things that's so interesting about working with translators is you begin to understand that the original book was already a rough translation of the greater book in your mind. So
it's such a good idea.
The original is a translation, and then it moves on into Finnish or Japanese or whatever. But I feel like I can't get too precious about translations because what I've given you is not the book I meant to write.
But the crazy thing is, like, that goes back to this medieval idea that the entire world is a book, and that we can't read the language anymore of it. But every once in a while, and these are moments of rapture, these are moments of a few lines of it are illuminated that you can read. And those are the moments in life that, you know, we remember. And so I feel like whatever this big book is, like you get a little bit of it illuminated and you make your own tiny version, but I can't read most of it.
On that note, thank you. It was lovely talking to you all.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me